The morning air at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado cut like a blade, carrying salt and promise in equal measure. 28 men stood shivering on the beach, their bodies still adjusting to the shock of the 5 a.m. ocean plunge that had been their unwelcome wake-up call. Among them, like a tree among saplings, stood James Washington, 63 years old, ebony skin weathered by decades of sun and stories, back straight despite years that should have bent it. He didn't belong here, and everyone knew it. "All right, Grandpa," Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Reeves boomed, circling James like a shark that had spotted something wounded. "You sure your heart medication is up to date? Might want to call your nurse before we really get started." Scattered laughter rippled through the group of young recruits, most in their 20s, bodies sculpted to perfection, and minds convinced of their invincibility. James didn't flinch, didn't even blink. His eyes, deep brown pools that reflected nothing, remained fixed forward, seeing something beyond the horizon that the others couldn't. "Week 1, Day 1 of Bud S training," Reeves continued, pacing the line of shivering men. "By the end of Hell Week, most of you will be gone. By graduation, only the elite will remain." His eyes lingered on James longer than necessary. "Some of you clearly won't make it past lunch." This SEAL training class was different, a special pilot program authorized by Naval Special Warfare Command, an experiment born of desperation and changing times. The official language called it an assessment of non-traditional warfare expertise integration. But everyone knew the truth. The Navy was testing whether specialized knowledge could compensate for physical limitations in certain strategic operations. James was the test case no one wanted. Lucas Chen, 26 and already a distinguished Force Recon Marine, stood 3 positions down from James in the line. Unlike the others, he didn't laugh. Something about the old man's stillness spoke to him, a language of control he recognized from the most dangerous men he'd served with in Afghanistan. 2-mile ocean swim, gentlemen," Reeves announced with a smile that promised suffering. "Fail to complete it in under 90 minutes and you can pack your bags. Grandpa gets a 10-minute head start. He's gonna need it." More laughter, sharper this time. James simply walked forward, his movements economical, nothing wasted. He entered the water without hesitation while the young men watched, many already writing the mental story of how the old man would wash out, become another cautionary tale about knowing your limitations. "What's his deal anyway?" whispered Dylan Foster, a former college swimming champion from Texas. "Some kind of affirmative action publicity stunt?" Chen shook his head. "Admiral Thompson personally signed his admission papers. That's all I know." "He's gonna die out there," another recruit muttered. "Man's collecting Social Security, not going to war." But James didn't die. He swam with a mechanical precision that spoke of thousands of hours in the water. Not the fastest, not the most graceful, but relentless, like water itself wearing down stone. When the other recruits were finally released to swim, they passed him, some deliberately splashing extra water in his face or swimming unnecessarily close. James adjusted his course slightly and continued without acknowledgement. Chen caught up to the old man halfway through the course. Instead of passing him, he matched his pace for a few strokes. "You good, sir?" he asked between measured breaths. James turned his head just enough to make eye contact without breaking stroke. "Save your energy, son. Race isn't against me." Chen nodded and pushed forward, but the brief exchange left him wondering. The eyes that had met his weren't desperate or defensive. They were assessing, calculating, the eyes of a predator, not prey. James finished the swim in 78 minutes. Not impressive by SEAL standards, but well within requirements. As he walked out of the ocean, his dark skin glistening in the morning sun, the whispers started again. Reeves looked almost disappointed. "Log PT!" Reeves barked once everyone had completed the swim. "Teams of 6. Each team carries 1 log. Drop it and everyone does 100 push-ups before continuing." The logs, telephone poles stripped of branches and polished smooth by years of SEAL candidates' suffering, lay waiting on the beach. 200 pounds of waterlogged wood designed to crush teamwork out of individualists. Teams formed quickly, friends gravitating toward each other, stronger recruits banding together. James stood alone until 5 men remained without a group. They approached him with the enthusiasm of prisoners walking to execution. "Just don't slow us down, old man," Foster said, taking position at the front of the log. "And if you need to tap out, do it quick so they can get us a replacement." James said nothing, merely nodded and took his position at the rear of the log. When Reeves gave the command, they hoisted it to their shoulders. The first few steps were coordinated, almost easy. Then came the commands to raise the log overhead, to run with it, to hold it at arm's length. The real test had begun. 30 minutes in, Foster was the first to show fatigue, his shoulders trembling. "This is insane," he gasped. "How long are we doing this?" "Until someone quits," Chen answered from the middle position. "That's the point." "Old man's gonna break first," someone muttered. "Just watch." But James's section of the log remained steady, his breathing controlled. Sweat poured from his body, but his expression never changed. No grimace of pain, no indication of strain beyond the physiological. The younger men began stealing glances at him, confusion mixing with their exhaustion. 2 hours later, after running miles across the beach with the log, performing endless push-ups and enduring Reeves's creative verbal abuse, Foster's knees buckled. The log dipped on his end, threatening to fall. "I can't," he gasped. "I'm done." Without a word, James shifted position, compensating for the imbalance, taking more weight onto his own shoulders. The movement was subtle, but saved them from dropping the log and facing additional punishment. "I didn't ask for your help," Foster hissed when he regained his footing. James's response was barely audible. "Didn't do it for you." When Reeves finally called an end to the log PT, the team placed their burden down with the careful reverence of pallbearers. Foster immediately collapsed onto the sand. Others bent double, hands on knees, sucking air. James stood straight, chest heaving but posture unbroken. "Water break," Reeves announced. 5 minutes, then we run." The recruits staggered to their water bottles. James walked, never rushed, never hurried, and took careful, measured sips while others gulped desperately. "He's not human," Foster whispered to Chen as they watched the old man. "Nobody his age moves like that after what we just did." Chen shrugged. "Maybe he's just been through worse." The day continued. Endless push-ups, pull-ups, flutter kicks, and running. Always running. By late afternoon, 3 candidates had quit, ringing the ceremonial bell that signified surrender. James remained, completing each evolution with the same metronomic consistency. Not the best, never the best, but never stopping. During the final exercise, a brutal circuit of carrying wounded comrades, James was paired with Foster. The younger man made no effort to hide his displeasure. "Just don't drop me, Grandpa," he sneered as James prepared to lift him in a fireman's carry. Something flickered in the old man's eyes then. The first real emotion anyone had seen all day. Not anger, but something colder and more dangerous. He said nothing as he hoisted Foster's 220-pound frame across his shoulders and began the course. Halfway through, Foster felt something he couldn't immediately identify. James's shirt had ridden up slightly, where Foster's arm wrapped around his shoulder. Against the dark skin of the old man's back, partially revealed by the shifted fabric, was a tattoo, intricate, faded with age, but unmistakable in what it represented. A SEAL trident. Not a replica, not the kind civilians got to look tough. This was the real thing, worn into skin that had earned it. But it was different somehow, older looking, with subtle variations Foster couldn't quite place. Before he could process what he was seeing, James had completed the course and set him down. Foster stared at the old man, trying to reconcile the mysterious tattoo with the person he'd spent all day mocking. "You were," he began, but James cut him off with a slight shake of his head. The message was clear: not here, not now. As the recruits dragged themselves to the barracks that evening, bodies aching and spirits tested, the whispers about James took on a different tone. The mockery remained, but now carried an undercurrent of uncertainty. In the shower, Chen noticed what Foster had glimpsed. The tattoo on James's back wasn't just a trident. Surrounding it were other markings, faded with age, but distinct enough to raise questions: a date, a location, and something that looked like a unit designation that Chen didn't recognize. Later, as the recruits lay in their racks, too exhausted to sleep, Foster leaned over to Chen. "Did you see it?" he whispered. Chen nodded. "Trident's real, but it's old. Different design." "That's not possible," Foster insisted. "The old man would have been, what, 40 years too old for Buddy S. when he supposedly went through?" "Maybe it's not ours," Chen suggested, the thought forming as he spoke it. "Could be from somewhere else, another program." Across the room, James lay perfectly still, eyes closed, breathing the measured rhythm of a man who knew how to find rest in chaos. Tomorrow would be harder. They all knew it. But for the first time, the recruits weren't wondering if the old man would quit. They were wondering who he really was. And in the darkness of the barracks, as the future Navy SEALs succumbed to exhaustion one by one, James Washington opened his eyes and stared at the ceiling, memories surfacing like bodies in deep water, rising whether he wanted them to or not. The tattoo on his back seemed to burn suddenly, a phantom pain from wounds both physical and otherwise, sustained in a war most history books didn't acknowledge, and in places that officially never saw American boots on the ground. Tomorrow they would push him harder. They always did, once they started getting curious. And James would have to decide how much of his past he was willing to reveal and how much needed to stay buried for everyone's sake. Dawn arrived without mercy, painting the barracks in harsh fluorescent light 2 hours before the sun would actually rise. The instructors moved through the rows of bunks, metal trash cans clanging against metal frames, creating a cacophony designed to disorient and distress. "Rise and shine, ladies," Reeves's voice cut through the noise. "You've got exactly 2 minutes to be on the beach in formation. Every second late is 50 push-ups." The barracks erupted into controlled chaos, 25 men scrambling for boots and uniforms, cursing under breath, bodies still aching from yesterday's ordeal. James moved with the same deliberate efficiency he'd shown the day before, no faster or slower than necessary, wasting no energy on panic. Chen noticed that while others frantically tied bootlaces or searched for misplaced items, James was already dressed, bed made with hospital corners sharp enough to cut paper. The old man had clearly been awake before the instructors arrived. "How the hell are you already ready?" Foster whispered as he hopped on one foot, struggling with his boot. James didn't answer, just moved toward the door in the same measured stride that seemed to be his only speed. But Chen caught the slightest curve at the corner of the old man's mouth. Not quite a smile, more like the ghost of one. On the beach, a new instructor waited alongside Reeves. Chief Petty Officer Lisa Ramirez stood with arms crossed, her compact frame containing more concentrated intensity than men twice her size. Her reputation preceded her, a decorated combat veteran with multiple deployments, known for breaking even the toughest candidates. "Whenever you decide to grace us with your presence," she called out as the recruits formed their lines, "we can begin our gentle morning yoga session." The last few stragglers sprinted into formation, breathing hard. James stood at the end of the front row, exactly where he'd been the day before. 12 seconds late," Ramirez announced, checking her watch. "That's 600 push-ups we owe, but first let's wake up those muscles with a nice 4-mile run." She smiled, the expression somehow more threatening than Reeves's permanent scowl. "And since Grandpa here managed to be on time while you infants were still looking for your pacifiers, he gets to set the pace." Murmurs rippled through the formation. Setting the pace was usually a punishment for the fastest runner, forcing them to go slower for the group. For James, everyone assumed it would be the opposite problem. "Move out, Washington," Ramirez ordered. Without hesitation, James began running. The pace he set wasn't blistering, but it wasn't the slow jog everyone expected either. He found that middle ground, challenging but sustainable, that experienced runners recognize as the most difficult to maintain. The younger recruits exchanged confused glances as they fell in behind him. "How long do you think he can keep this up?" someone muttered. 5 minutes tops, another answered. But 5 minutes became 10, 10 became 20, and James maintained the exact same pace, his breathing steady, his form unchanged. The only evidence of effort was the sweat darkening his shirt and the intense focus in his eyes. Halfway through the run, Ramirez brought her bullhorn to her lips. "Let's make this interesting. Washington, new pace. I want to see what you've really got." James increased his speed immediately, not dramatically, but noticeably. The adjustment caught several recruits off guard, forcing them to expend precious energy to catch up. Foster, who had positioned himself near the front to keep an eye on the old man, felt his lungs begin to burn. "He's doing it on purpose," Foster gasped to Chen. "Trying to break us." Chen, whose own conditioning was exceptional, studied James's form. "No," he replied between measured breaths. "He's running exactly how they taught us in recon. Maximum efficiency, minimal energy waste. He's been through this before." As they completed the run, returning to the beach with the sun now peeking over the horizon, James showed fewer signs of fatigue than men a third his age. Foster collapsed onto the sand, chest heaving. Others bent double, sucking air. James stood straight, breathing hard but controlled, waiting for the next instruction. Ramirez approached him, studying his face with clinical detachment. "Impressive, Washington. Where'd you learn to pace like that?" James met her gaze directly. "Jungle running isn't about speed, Chief. It's about endurance." Something passed between them, a current of recognition. Ramirez's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Which jungle would that be?" "The kind that doesn't appear on maps," James replied quietly. She held his gaze a moment longer, then turned away. "Those push-ups aren't going to do themselves, ladies. 600 starting now." As the class dropped to the position, Ramirez walked among them, her attention seemingly divided between monitoring form and stealing glances at Washington. During a brief water break an hour later, she pulled Reeves aside, their conversation just out of earshot but clearly intense. The day progressed through increasingly brutal evolutions, swimming with hands and feet bound, crawling through mud under barbed wire, carrying heavy rubber boats overhead until shoulders screamed for relief. 2 more candidates quit before noon, bringing the total to 5. James continued, never at the front of the pack, but never at the back either, occupying that middle space that drew less attention. During the afternoon combat training session, the class paired off for hand-to-hand drills. Foster, still nursing his wounded pride from the previous day, maneuvered to partner with James. His intention was clear to everyone who saw his face. "Remember, this is technique practice, not a competition," the instructor announced. "Control your strikes and respect the tap-out." Foster nodded, already visualizing how he would establish dominance over the old man. When the signal came to begin, he launched forward with a textbook perfect takedown attempt, the same move that had won him state wrestling championships in high school. What happened next occurred so quickly that most observers couldn't track the individual movements. James shifted slightly, the minimal movement necessary, not an inch more, and Foster found himself suddenly airborne, his own momentum weaponized against him. He hit the sand flat on his back, the impact driving the air from his lungs. Before he could process what had happened, James had a knee precisely positioned over his throat, not pressing down, but present with the unmistakable message that it could. "Technique, not competition," James reminded him quietly, then released the hold and offered Foster a hand up. Foster ignored the offered help, scrambling to his feet with his face burning in humiliation. "Lucky move," he spat. James simply resumed the ready position, waiting. Foster attacked again, this time with a more cautious approach. The result was the same. His own energy and aggression turned against him with such subtle efficiency that it almost appeared Foster had thrown himself to the ground. After the third takedown, Foster remained on the sand longer, the fight draining from him along with his certainty. "How?" he finally asked, accepting James's hand this time. "Combat judo," James replied. "Works best when your opponent believes size is an advantage." "That wasn't in any Bud's curriculum I've studied," Foster said, brushing sand from his uniform. James's expression remained neutral, but something flickered behind his eyes. "No," he agreed. "It wasn't." By evening mess, the whispers about James had evolved into open speculation. The tattoo, his fighting style, the enigmatic comments about jungles not on maps. The evidence was mounting that the old man was not what he initially seemed. In the chow hall, Chen finally claimed the seat across from James, who ate with the same methodical precision he applied to everything else. "Permission to speak freely, sir?" Chen asked quietly. James looked up, a hint of amusement crossing his features. "I'm not an officer, son." "Maybe not now," Chen replied. "But you were something." James continued eating, neither confirming nor denying. Chen pressed on. "That trident on your back, it's real, but it's different. Older design. And the unit markings around it. I've studied special operations history. I don't recognize them." James set down his fork and studied Chen with new intensity. "What exactly are you asking, recruit?" Chen leaned forward slightly. "Were you part of a SEAL team before there were SEAL teams?" The question hung between them. For the first time, James's carefully maintained composure showed a crack, a brief flash of something between surprise and caution. He glanced around the chow hall, noting which instructors were present and how many ears might be within range. "You've got imagination, Chen," he finally said. "Keep it in check. This program is about what you can do, not what I might have done." Before Chen could respond, an announcement crackled over the speakers. "All Bud S Class 336 recruits report to the briefing room immediately following chow. Instructors Reeves and Ramirez will escort you." The unusual announcement sent a ripple of tension through the hall. Evening briefings typically meant one thing: a night evolution, the kind designed to push sleep-deprived candidates past breaking point. "Here we go," Foster muttered from the next table. "They're gonna drown us tonight." As the recruits filed into the briefing room 30 minutes later, they found not just their regular instructors, but Commander Alan Thomas, the officer in charge of the entire Bud S program. His presence elevated the tension immediately. Behind him, projected on the wall, was an image that caused the room to fall completely silent. It was an old black-and-white photograph, at least 50 years old judging by the quality and uniform shown. In it, 6 men stood on a beach, their faces grim, bodies lean and hard. They wore mixed clothing, some pieces recognizable as military issue, others clearly improvised. Each man had a patch partially visible on his shoulder, similar to but distinct from the SEAL trident that current graduates received, and in the center of the group, unmistakable despite the half-century that had passed, stood a young James Washington. "Gentlemen," Commander Thomas began, his voice cutting through the stunned silence, "it's time to properly introduce you to your classmate, Commander Thomas let the photograph speak for itself a moment longer, allowing the shock to settle across the room. The young recruit stared at the image, then at James, then back at the image, trying to reconcile the fierce young warrior in the photo with the elderly man who sat among them, his face betraying nothing. "Most of what I'm about to tell you," Thomas continued, "remains classified to this day. You're being granted temporary clearance because Command believes there's something valuable to be learned here, something that can't be taught in any manual or training exercise." He touched a small remote, and the image changed to another photograph, this one showing a map of Southeast Asia with certain areas circled in red. In 1961, before the majority of American forces entered Vietnam officially, the U.S. military began deploying small, specialized units for reconnaissance and direct action missions. These weren't called SEALs yet, that designation wouldn't come until 1962, but they were the prototype for what would become the Naval Special Warfare Community. Foster raised his hand, his expression a mixture of confusion and lingering skepticism. "Sir, are you saying Washington was in Vietnam before Vietnam?" Thomas nodded. "Not just in Vietnam. Laos, Cambodia, places where officially no American troops ever set foot." He glanced at James. "Master Chief Washington was part of a specialized six-man team that operated under the designation MAC-VSOG, Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, Studies and Observation Group." The abbreviation meant nothing to most recruits, but Chen sat up straighter. As a student of military history, he recognized the name of one of the most secretive and effective special operations units in American military history. "For those who don't know," Thomas continued, "SOG was the predecessor to modern special operations. They conducted cross-border operations, trained indigenous forces, gathered intelligence, and executed high-risk missions deep in enemy territory. Their casualty rate exceeded 100%, meaning every operator was wounded on average, more than once." The room fell completely silent. Even Foster was staring at James with new eyes now. Washington's team, call sign Spectre, operated longer and deeper behind enemy lines than any other SOG team. The majority of their missions remained classified, but their contribution to the war effort and the development of modern special warfare tactics is immeasurable. The slide changed again, showing a grainy image of what appeared to be a prisoner of war camp surrounded by dense jungle. In 1970, after intelligence indicated that American POWs were being held at a secret camp in Laos, Spectre team was tasked with a reconnaissance mission to verify the intel and assess the feasibility of a rescue operation. The mission was compromised. Of the six-man team, only one made it back. All eyes turned to James. His expression remained impassive, but there was a distance in his gaze now, as though he were seeing not the briefing room but something much farther away and long ago. Chief Washington survived 14 days evading enemy patrols through some of the most hostile jungle terrain on Earth. He carried the body of his team leader for the first 3 days, unwilling to leave him behind, until physical necessity forced him to create a hasty burial site. When he finally reached extraction, he had lost 60 pounds and was suffering from malaria, multiple shrapnel wounds, and jungle rot so severe that doctors initially recommended amputating both feet. Reeves, standing at the back of the room, shifted uncomfortably. His earlier mockery of the old man now hung in the air like an undetonated mine. After recovery, Washington continued serving. He helped establish the training protocols that would eventually evolve into the BUD-S program you're experiencing now. Many of the evolutions you'll face in the coming weeks were designed or refined by the man sitting among you. Foster raised his hand again. "Sir, with all due respect, if Washington was part of all this history, why haven't we heard of him before? Why isn't he in the books?" Thomas exchanged a glance with James, who gave an almost imperceptible nod, permission to continue. "2 reasons, recruit. First, much of SOG's work remained highly classified for decades. Second, he paused, choosing his words carefully, the military of that era wasn't always eager to publicize the heroism of certain service members. The implication was clear. Chen glanced at James, suddenly understanding something deeper about the old man's stoic demeanor. He hadn't just battled enemy forces. He'd fought for recognition within his own military, within a system that wasn't designed to acknowledge his contributions. Washington received the Navy Cross for his actions, though many who know the full story believe he deserved the Medal of Honor. The citation remains classified, but I've had the privilege of reading it. Trust me when I say it would redefine your understanding of human endurance. Thomas turned off the projector, the room falling into relative darkness for a moment before he switched on the regular lights. Master Chief Washington has agreed to join this Bud S class not as a student, though he's humble enough to participate as one, but as a living resource. He's here to observe, to provide insight to the instructor cadre, and occasionally, when appropriate, to share his experience with you directly. Ramirez stepped forward then, which means you will address him as Master Chief Washington from this point forward. And if I hear one more grandpa comment from any of you, you'll be doing push-ups until your great-grandchildren are born. Thomas nodded his thanks to Ramirez, then turned back to the class. Questions? The room remained silent, still processing the revelation. Finally, Chen raised his hand. Master Chief, if you were part of the original teams that became SEALs, why does your tattoo look different from the modern trident? James spoke for the first time since entering the room, his voice quiet, but carrying effortlessly. Because we made them ourselves, son. Out in the jungle, with sewing needles and whatever ink we could find or make. No fancy tattoo parlors in the Laotian highlands. A ripple of nervous laughter broke the tension. Thomas checked his watch. You're dismissed for the evening. Tomorrow's evolution begins at 500. I suggest you get what rest you can. As the recruits filed out, Foster found himself walking beside James. No, Master Chief Washington, he corrected himself mentally. The young man struggled to find words, embarrassment and curiosity warring within him. Master Chief, he finally managed, I want to apologize for... Don't, James interrupted, his tone neutral but firm. You didn't know. Now you do. Move forward. Foster nodded, swallowing his pride. Can I ask you something? James glanced at him. You can ask. Why put yourself through this again? Bud S, I mean. You've already proven everything there is to prove. James was silent for several steps, and Foster thought he might not answer. Then, so quietly, Foster had to lean closer to hear. Some debts can never be fully paid, son. But you keep paying anyway. Back in the barracks, the atmosphere had transformed completely. The recruits moved around James with a new awareness, their previous mockery replaced by something between respect and awe. None knew quite how to interact with him now. Was he an instructor, a teammate, a living legend? James, for his part, continued as he had before, neither seeking special treatment nor avoiding interaction. As he made his bunk with the same precise movements he'd demonstrated that morning, Chen approached cautiously. Master Chief, may I speak with you? James nodded, continuing his work. The photograph, the original SOG team. You were the only African American in the unit. I was, James confirmed, smoothing a wrinkle from his blanket. Was that common? James straightened, meeting Chen's gaze directly. I was the only one in SOG at that time, one of 3 in the entire precursor program to naval special warfare. Chen absorbed this. That must have been difficult. Different kind of difficult than what my father faced in Korea or my grandfather in the Pacific. Different from what my great-grandfather faced being forced to dig latrines for white soldiers in the Great War. James's voice held no self-pity, just a matter-of-fact assessment. Each generation carries its own weight. Is that why you never sought recognition, even after classification was lifted? A rare smile crossed James's weathered face. You ask a lot of questions, son. Sorry, Master Chief. Didn't say it was a problem. Questions keep you alive in hostile territory. Just make sure you're ready for the answers. James sat on his bunk, the first sign of fatigue he'd shown all day. Recognition wasn't important to me. The work was. The men next to me were. Making sure what we learned didn't die with us. That mattered. Across the barracks, other recruits were clearly eavesdropping while pretending not to. James noticed, but didn't seem to mind. Tomorrow's going to test you in ways you haven't imagined, he said, raising his voice slightly so others could hear. Not just physically. They'll push you until your mind wants to quit before your body does. Any advice, Master Chief? Someone called out. James considered the question. When you think you're done, you're only 40% spent. That's science, not motivation. Your brain is wired to conserve energy, to pull the emergency brake long before you're in actual danger. Learning to override that signal is what separates those who make it from those who don't. The barracks fell silent, recruits contemplating his words. Foster, who had been keeping his distance, finally approached. Master Chief, there's something I still don't understand. If you helped create Bud S, why are they putting you through it now? What's the point of this pilot program they mentioned? James studied Foster's face for a moment, assessing his sincerity. The world is changing, son. Warfare is changing. The days of pure physical dominance determining battlefield success are fading. They're experimenting with integrating different types of operators, older, experienced warriors alongside young, strong ones. Institutional knowledge paired with physical peak performance. He glanced around the barracks. You all joke about my age, but there are men like me operating in Syria, Afghanistan, and a dozen places not in the news. Men who can't do 1,000 push-ups anymore, but who can read a tribal village's mood in 5 minutes or spot an ambush being set from subtle cues you haven't learned to recognize yet. Foster processed this, his worldview visibly expanding in real time. So you're not really being evaluated like we are. Oh, I'm being evaluated, James corrected him, just on different metrics. And so are all of you, on how you adapt to working with someone you initially underestimated. As lights out approached, the recruits settled into their bunks with a new understanding of both their unusual classmate and the true purpose of their shared ordeal. The mockery had vanished completely, replaced by a mixture of respect and curiosity. Some still harbored doubts about whether an elderly man belonged in their ranks regardless of his history, but none would voice such thoughts aloud now. In the darkness, as his young teammates drifted toward sleep, James Washington remained awake, staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow would bring Hell Week, the most brutal phase of SEAL training, where candidates were pushed to physical and mental breaking points through 5.5 days of continuous activity, with a total of only 4 hours of sleep. For the young men around him, it represented the greatest challenge they had ever faced. For James, it stirred memories of a different hell, one with real bullets and no safety protocols where failure meant death or worse. The young recruits would learn what they were made of in the coming days. James already knew. That was both his blessing and his curse. Hell Week began with explosions. The recruits had finally fallen into exhausted sleep after midnight when the barracks erupted into chaos. Flash-bang grenades, instructors firing blanks, air horns blaring, and smoke canisters hissing. Disoriented men stumbled from bunks, some hitting the floor, others frozen in momentary panic. Move! 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 Multiple instructors screamed simultaneously, creating a wall of sound designed to overwhelm rational thought. You have 30 seconds to be on the beach. In the artificial fog and strobing lights, recruits crashed into each other, frantically pulling on boots and uniforms. Several were already coughing from the smoke, eyes watering, equilibrium shattered before the ordeal had even properly begun. Through the chaos, Chen noticed something odd. Washington's bunk was empty, already made. The old man was gone before the assault had even started. On the beach, instructors had created a nightmare tableau. Floodlights cast harsh shadows across obstacles arranged in the sand. A line of rubber boats waited at the water's edge. Massive speakers blasted a disorienting mixture of heavy metal, helicopter sounds, and recorded gunfire. And standing in the center of it all, somehow looking completely unaffected by the madness, was Master Chief Washington. "Form up!" Ramirez screamed through her bullhorn as recruits staggered onto the beach. "You're already behind schedule." The class struggled to assemble in neat rows, their earlier military precision now a distant memory. When they finally managed some semblance of formation, Reeves stepped forward. "Welcome to Hell Week, ladies," he said, his voice almost gentle in contrast to the earlier shouting, which made it somehow more terrifying. "For the next 5.5 days you will be cold, wet, exhausted, and pushed beyond what you believe are your limits." He gestured toward the water. "The surf is waiting for you and it's feeling lonely." What followed was the beginning of a carefully orchestrated dismantling of human willpower, an evolution designed over decades to identify those with the mental fortitude to continue when every fiber of their being screamed to stop. The recruits began with surf torture, lying in the frigid Pacific water until their bodies approached hypothermia, then performing exercises on the beach to warm up just enough to prevent medical emergency, before returning to the water again. The cycle continued for hours, broken occasionally by boat drills or log PT. Throughout it all, Washington performed every evolution, enduring the same conditions as men a third his age. The instructors didn't cut him any slack, but neither did they focus special attention on him as they had before. His status had shifted. He was no longer a curiosity or an object of derision. He had become something else, a standard. By sunrise, the first 2 candidates had quit, ringing the brass bell that signified surrender. By noon, 3 more had followed. Each departure thinned the class, but simultaneously strengthened the resolve of those remaining. For each man who broke, those still enduring felt a grim validation of their own fortitude. During a rare 5-minute water break, Foster collapsed next to Washington, who was calmly sipping from his canteen. "Master Chief," Foster gasped, "how did you know? About the raid on the barracks?" Washington took another measured sip before answering. "Patterns, instructors' prep routines, they still use the same playbook we developed 50 years ago." "You could have warned us," Foster said, a hint of accusation in his voice. Washington shook his head. "Wouldn't have helped. Some lessons can't be taught, only experienced." Before Foster could respond, Reeves's voice boomed across the beach. "Break's over. Boat crews form up." The class divided into boat crews of 6, each team responsible for carrying their IBS inflatable boat Small through the next series of challenges. Washington joined Foster's crew, which also included Chen and 3 others. They hoisted the heavy rubber craft above their heads and began running down the beach. 5 miles, gentlemen," Ramirez called out cheerfully. "Just a light jog with your new girlfriend." 2 miles in, one of their crew, Rodriguez, a former Marine with tree trunk legs but less upper body strength, began faltering. The boat tilted dangerously as his arms trembled with fatigue. "I can't," Rodriguez gasped, his face contorted with effort. "Switch positions," Washington ordered, his voice cutting through Rodriguez's panic. "Chen and Foster, rotate to Rodriguez's corner. Rodriguez, take center position." They executed the change awkwardly but without dropping the boat. Washington had placed Rodriguez where the weight distribution was more manageable while putting the stronger recruits at the corners where the strain was greatest. "Master Chief," Rodriguez panted, shame evident in his voice, "I'm sorry." "Never apologize for weakness," Washington replied. "Recognize it, adapt to it, overcome it when possible." Work around it when necessary. His words carried to the other boat crews running nearby. Several instructors exchanged glances but allowed the impromptu lesson to continue. In real operations, Washington continued, his breathing controlled despite the exertion. You'll never have a team of identical strengths. You'll have snipers who can't swim well, swimmers who can't navigate, navigators who can't communicate with locals. Success isn't about being perfect at everything, it's about perfect coordination of different capabilities. The boat seemed lighter somehow after that, though the physical weight hadn't changed. They completed the 5 miles without further incident. As the sun began to set on the first full day of Hell Week, the class faced the dreaded log PT once again. By now, their muscles were screaming from over 18 hours of continuous activity. Several recruits vomited between evolutions. Others moved with the vacant stare of men operating on automatic pilot, their conscious minds having retreated from the constant pain. Washington, however, maintained the same methodical pace he'd established from the beginning. He wasn't the strongest or fastest, but his consistency was unnerving, like a metronome continuing to tick while all around it chaos reigned. During one particularly brutal sequence, Foster's grip finally failed. The log dipped sharply, nearly crushing a recruit named Alvarez. Washington reacted instantly, shifting position to take the additional weight while stabilizing the log. Reeves noticed but said nothing, simply making a note on his clipboard. When they finally set the log down, Foster's hands were bleeding from torn calluses. He stared at them dumbly, as if they belonged to someone else. "Here," Washington said quietly, pulling something from his pocket, a small tin of what looked like waxy ointment. "Rub this in. Won't stop the pain, but will prevent infection and help the skin toughen." Foster applied the salve mechanically. "What is this stuff?" "Tiger balm mixed with beeswax and iodine, old jungle recipe." From nearby, Chen watched the interaction with interest. Washington's small acts of assistance never crossed the line into doing the work for them, but always provided just enough support to prevent failure. It was a master class in leadership, knowing exactly when to step in and when to let others struggle. As darkness fell completely, the instructors finally ordered the class into the chow hall for their first meal since the ordeal began. The recruits fell upon the food like starving animals, many too exhausted to even speak. But after a few minutes of eating, Reeves's whistle cut through the hall. "Time's up! Back to the beach!" Groans echoed across the room as half-eaten meals were abandoned. The recruits staggered to their feet, muscles stiffening from even that brief period of rest. Outside, a new horror awaited. The instructors had set up powerful hoses, blasting seawater with fire hydrant force. "Everyone's too clean," Ramirez shouted with mock concern. "We need to fix that before night swim." One by one, recruits were forced to approach and be blasted with the freezing water, knocking many off their feet. When Washington's turn came, he walked forward with the same calm dignity he'd shown all day. But as he stood before the hose, Reeves hesitated, the nozzle lowering slightly. "Master Chief," he said, his voice uncharacteristically respectful, "you don't have to." "Hit me, Chief," Washington interrupted firmly. "These men deserve leaders who share their hardships." Reeves met his eyes for a long moment, then nodded and opened the valve. The powerful stream caught Washington square in the chest, staggering him back a step. But he didn't fall. He leaned into the icy blast, feet planted wide, taking the full force without breaking eye contact with Reeves. When it was over, Washington walked back to his position in formation, water streaming from his soaked uniform. Not a single recruit spoke, but something had changed in how they looked at him. The respect that had begun with the revelation of his past had deepened into something more profound. The night swim that followed tested everyone's primal fears. In the pitch darkness, with only chemical light sticks marking their positions, recruits had to navigate a complex course through the cold ocean. The darkness and disorientation triggered panic in even the strongest swimmers. "Remember your training," Washington's voice carried across the water as he tread beside a struggling Foster. "Control your breathing first, everything else follows." Foster's wild splashing calmed slightly. "I can't see where I'm going," he gasped. "You don't need to see," Washington replied. "Feel the current. Listen to the waves breaking on shore. Your senses will compensate if you stop fighting them." By the time they emerged from the water, Foster wasn't exactly comfortable in the darkness, but he had found something new. Not confidence exactly, but a framework for managing his fear. Other recruits who had overheard Washington's guidance were attempting to apply the same principles with varying degrees of success. As night deepened, the instructors finally allowed a brief rest period, 40 minutes to dry off, change clothes, and close their eyes. The recruits collapsed wherever they could find space, many asleep before they were even horizontal. Washington sat against a wall, eyes closed but posture still disciplined. Chen approached quietly, sitting beside him. "Master Chief," he whispered, "are you actually sleeping?" Washington's eyes opened, alert and clear. Resting, not sleeping. Old habit. "From Vietnam?" Washington nodded slightly. "In the jungle, full sleep was a luxury we rarely enjoyed. You learn to rest parts of your body and mind in rotation. 5 minutes here, 10 minutes there. That's how you're doing this, isn't it? While we're all falling apart, you're just managing your resources." A faint smile crossed Washington's weathered face. "There's a difference between endurance and suffering, son. Most people never learn it." Chen mulled this over, fighting his own exhaustion. "Why put yourself through this again? Really?" Washington was silent for so long that Chen thought he might not answer. Then, almost inaudibly, "Some ghosts can only be laid to rest by returning to the place they were born." Before Chen could ask what he meant, Ramirez's whistle pierced the brief tranquility. "Rest time's over, ladies. Back to the surf. The fun is just beginning." As the recruits staggered back to their feet, Washington rose in a single fluid motion, still conserving energy even in this simple action. The night stretched before them, promising new torments, new limits to be tested and broken. But something had shifted in the class dynamic. They moved now not as individuals being broken, but as a unit being forged. And at the center of this transformation was the old warrior who carried decades of battles in the lines on his face and the scars beneath his uniform, a man who had come back not just to teach, but perhaps to find his own redemption in the suffering. By the middle of the second day of Hell Week, the human mind's relationship with time began to distort. For the recruits still enduring, minutes stretched into hours during suffering, then suddenly compressed when a rare moment of respite appeared. The constant cycle of surf torture, boat drills, log PT, and runs created a nightmarish rhythm where past and future ceased to exist. There was only the eternal, punishing present. 7 more had quit since the night swim, reducing the class by nearly half. Those remaining moved like automatons, functioning purely on muscle memory and stubborn will. Speech had become a luxury few could afford to waste energy on. The sun beat down mercilessly as the class ran in formation, carrying their IBS boats overhead. Their uniforms had long since been saturated with a mixture of sweat, sand, and seawater, creating a uniquely effective form of sandpaper that wore away its skin with every movement. Blood from chafed shoulders and necks mingled with the salt and grime. Washington maintained his position at a corner of Foster's boat crew, his breathing measured, his eyes alert, despite the deep fatigue etched into his features. Unlike many of the younger men, he hadn't succumbed to the 1,000-yard stare of sheer endurance. He remained present, aware, assessing. Instructor Reeves ran alongside their boat, his voice cutting through the haze of exhaustion. "Drop and recover, now!" The command triggered a practiced response. All boats were simultaneously lowered, then immediately hoisted overhead again. For bodies already pushed to their limits, the sudden shift in muscle tension caused several recruits to falter. In the boat crew next to Washington's, a recruit named Mitchell lost his grip. The boat tilted dangerously, threatening to crash onto the heads of his teammates. Without hesitation, Washington called out, "Crew 2, compensate port side." The instinctive response to Washington's command voice saved them. The remaining members of Crew 2 shifted position just enough to stabilize their boat before disaster struck. Mitchell recovered his grip, his face flushed with shame and gratitude. Reeves noticed the incident but said nothing, merely making another note on his ever-present clipboard. Hours later, as afternoon faded toward evening, the class found themselves back in the frigid Pacific for another evolution. This time they were ordered to link arms in a circle, treading water while singing Navy songs in unison, a task designed to seem absurd and foster resentment alongside the physical challenge. "Louder," Ramirez demanded from the safety of a small boat. "I can't hear your enthusiasm, recruits." As the circle of exhausted men struggled to stay afloat while bellowing anchors away, Chen noticed Washington's technique. While the younger men were using powerful kicks to stay above water, Washington barely moved, using tiny, efficient movements that kept his head up with minimal energy expenditure. "Master Chief," Chen whispered during a brief pause between verses, "how are you doing that?" "Water wants to hold you up," Washington replied quietly. "Stop fighting it. Small movements from your ankles, wrists. Let your lungs do most of the work." Chen tried to mimic the technique, immediately feeling the difference. It wasn't easier exactly. Nothing about Hell Week was easy, but it was more sustainable. He caught Foster's eye across the circle and subtly demonstrated the modified treading technique. Foster caught on quickly, then passed it to Rodriguez beside him. Within minutes, half the circle had adopted Washington's method. Ramirez, watching from the boat, leaned over to Reeves. "They're learning," she observed. Reeves nodded. "Question is, are they learning just to survive this, or learning something that matters?" With Washington setting the example. Both, I think. When the class finally dragged themselves ashore after the water evolution, they were met with a new form of psychological torture. The instructors had set up a warm tent near the beach, filled with the aroma of fresh coffee and hot food. Inside, clearly visible through the open flaps, several candidates who had quit earlier lounged comfortably, dry and rested, eating hamburgers. "Look at your classmates who decided this was too hard," Reeves announced. "They're warm, fed, and heading home to sleep in their beds tonight. All you have to do is ring that bell." He pointed to the brass bell mounted on a post nearby, "and you can join them. No shame, no judgment, just relief." It was a masterful psychological ploy. After nearly 40 hours without sleep, with their bodies pushed well beyond normal limits, the sight of comfort so close yet unattainable was almost unbearable. 2 more recruits broke formation and walked to the bell, each toll sending a ripple of both despair and renewed determination through those who remained. Washington watched the scene impassively, but a muscle in his jaw tightened. Chen, standing beside him, caught the subtle reaction. "Something wrong, Master Chief?" Washington's voice was low, meant only for Chen. "They're lying to them." "Sir?" "The ones who quit. There's plenty of shame waiting for them. They just don't know it yet." Before Chen could ask for clarification, Washington continued, "It's not the quitting that will haunt them. It's the not knowing." "Not knowing what?" Washington's eyes, despite the exhaustion that must have been crushing him, held a clarity that was almost unsettling. Whether they could have made it through. That question never goes away. Chen absorbed this, then asked, "Is that why you came back? To answer that question for yourself?" Washington didn't respond directly. Instead, he shifted topics with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to deflecting unwanted inquiries. Your form is slipping on the log, PT. You're loading too much weight on your shoulders instead of using your core. That's why your lower back is seizing up. Chen blinked, surprised both by the observation and the sudden change of subject. How did you know my back was— 50 years of watching men push past their limits, Washington interrupted. The body always tells the truth, even when the mind tries to hide it. Their conversation was cut short by Ramirez's whistle. Medical check. Form a line. The class shuffled toward the medical tent set up at the edge of the training area. Inside, Navy corpsmen waited to perform quick assessments, checking for hypothermia, dangerous levels of exhaustion, and injuries that might not be immediately apparent to men too delirious to recognize their own condition. As Washington waited his turn, Foster collapsed nearby, his legs simply giving out without warning. The medical team rushed to him, checking vital signs as he tried weakly to protest that he was fine. Blood sugar crash, one corpsman announced. Get some glucose in him, Stat. Washington watched with an intensity that seemed out of proportion to the routine medical emergency. As they administered the glucose solution to Foster, Washington approached the head corpsman, speaking too quietly for others to hear. After a brief conversation, the corpsman nodded and made a note in Foster's medical chart. Back outside, as Foster rejoined the group looking slightly more alert but still dangerously fatigued, Washington fell in beside him. What happened back there? Foster asked, embarrassed by his collapse. Your body's burning through glycogen faster than normal, Washington explained. It happens. Foster frowned. They said my levels were way too low. I don't understand. I've done endurance events before. Combat stress changes your metabolism, Washington said. Even simulated combat. Your insulin response is different because your body thinks it's fighting for survival, not just exercising. How did you know to tell them to check for that specifically? Washington's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. I've seen it before. In Vietnam, Washington nodded once. Patrol in Laos, 48 hours in triple canopy jungle. My radio man collapsed just like you did. We thought he was hit at first. It was the most specific detail about his past operations that Washington had volunteered since joining the class. Foster recognized the significance but knew better than to press. Thank you, he said simply. Washington acknowledged with a slight nod. Stay close to Chen during boat evolutions. His rhythm matches yours. You'll conserve energy. As night fell on the second day, the instructors introduced a new torment. The obstacle course now to be navigated in complete darkness. What was challenging in daylight became nearly impossible without visual references. Recruits crashed into barriers, fell from ropes, and became disoriented in the wooden tunnels that snaked through portions of the course. Washington moved through the obstacles with a deliberate caution that seemed slow, but actually resulted in fewer errors and a faster overall time than many of the younger recruits. Chen observed his technique closely, how Washington used his hands to feel the terrain ahead, how he counted steps between obstacles he'd memorized during daylight runs, how he oriented himself using the sound of the ocean rather than trying to peer through impenetrable darkness. During a particularly treacherous rope climb, Rodriguez lost his grip and fell nearly 15 feet, landing with a sickening crack. His scream cut through the night. Instructors and medical personnel converged immediately, flashlights suddenly illuminating the scene. Rodriguez lay clutching his leg, face contorted in pain. My ankle, he gasped. I think it's broken. Washington reached him before the medical team, kneeling beside the injured recruit. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, assessing the injury through touch while speaking calmly to Rodriguez. Breathe through it, son. Focus on my voice. The lead corpsman arrived, quickly examining the ankle. Looks like a break. We need to transport him. Rodriguez's eyes filled with tears. not from pain, but from the realization that his journey was over. "Master Chief," he pleaded, "I don't want to quit." Washington placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "This isn't quitting. This is recognizing reality." His voice dropped lower, sharing something meant only for Rodriguez. "The team needs you healed for the real fight, not crippled from proving a point here." As they carried Rodriguez away on a stretcher, the remaining recruits stood in somber silence. Another one gone, not by choice but by chance. It was a stark reminder of how quickly circumstances could change, how thin the line was between enduring and breaking. Reeves allowed the moment to settle before announcing, "Back to work, gentlemen. The obstacle course isn't going to complete itself." The class resumed their struggling progress through the darkness, but something had shifted in their collective psyche. Rodriguez's injury had punctured the illusion of invulnerability that many still clung to, replacing it with a more sobering awareness of their own fragility. Later, during a rare 5-minute water break, Chen found Washington sitting apart from the group, methodically checking his boots and socks. A crucial ritual for preventing the trench foot that had already claimed 2 candidates. "Master Chief," Chen said hesitantly, "what you said to Rodriguez about the real fight, what did you mean?" Washington continued his inspection, not looking up. "There's always another mission, son. Always something more important waiting after this. But for Rodriguez, there isn't. He's out." Washington finally raised his eyes, something haunted flickering behind them. "Not all battles are fought in uniform. Some of the hardest ones come after you take it off." Before Chen could pursue this line of thought, Washington asked a question of his own. "Why are you here, Chen? What are you running toward, or away from?" The unexpected reversal caught Chen off guard. He hesitated, formulating an answer that went beyond the standard patriotic platitudes. "My grandfather was with the Flying Tigers in China, American volunteer group before the U.S. officially entered World War II. He used to tell me stories about operating behind enemy lines, making a difference when officially we weren't even supposed to be there." Washington nodded, recognition flickering across his features. "Claire Chenot's outfit. Good men. You knew of them. Studied their operations. SOG borrowed some of their techniques for our work in Laos." Chen felt a connection forming, a bridge across generations of warriors operating in shadows. "I wanted to be part of that legacy. The men who go where others can't or won't." Washington studied him with new interest. "You're searching for something worthy of your sacrifice." It wasn't a question. "Aren't we all?" A rare, genuine smile crossed Washington's weathered face. "Perhaps we are, son. Perhaps we are." Dawn of the 3rd day broke over a drastically reduced class. Of the original 28 candidates, only 14 remained, shells of their former selves, moving through a fog of exhaustion so profound that reality itself had taken on a dreamlike quality. Hallucinations had begun for some, their sleep-deprived brains manufacturing visions and sounds that weren't there. The instructors, knowing this phase well, intensified their psychological pressure. They walked among the shivering recruits, whispering customized discouragement into receptive ears. "Your boat crew is carrying you, Foster. Your form is failing, Chen. How many more evolutions before your back gives out completely? The medical team has a bed ready for you, Johnson. They know you won't last the day." Washington watched this familiar ritual with detached interest. The instructors were skilled practitioners of the art of breaking men down to build them anew, but their approach to him had changed subtly. They no longer attempted to discourage him directly, perhaps recognizing the futility, perhaps out of growing respect. Instead, they largely ignored him, as if his presence was a given, rather than something to be challenged. The morning evolution was a particular form of torment called Around the World, a race where boat crews had to carry their IBS through a circuit of beach obstacles, then paddle out through the surf, around a distant buoy, and back to shore, only to repeat the entire sequence again, and again, and again. Foster's crew, now reduced to 5 with Rodriguez's departure, struggled more than most. The missing man's portion of weight had to be distributed among already exhausted bodies. As they staggered through their third circuit, Foster finally gave voice to what several had been thinking. "Master Chief," he gasped between labored breaths, "how long does this go on?" Washington, positioned at a corner of the boat, responded with the same measured cadence that somehow never faltered. "Until the instructors are satisfied, we've learned whatever lesson they've decided we need." "And what lesson is that?" Chen asked from the opposite corner. Washington's eyes scanned the beach, taking in the other struggling boat crews, the instructors positioning, the medical team standing by. "That your breaking point isn't where you think it is." Foster grunted in grim amusement. "I think I found mine about 12 hours ago." "Then you're operating beyond it now," Washington observed. "Remember that when this is over." As they reached the waterline and prepared to launch their boat into the surf, Instructor Ramirez appeared beside them. "Change of plans for this crew," she announced. "You're doing a rescue scenario. Man overboard at the far buoy." The team exchanged confused glances. This wasn't part of the standard Hell Week protocol. Ramirez pointed to a figure floating near the distant marker. A dummy waited to simulate an unconscious swimmer. "Standard recovery procedures," she continued. "Washington, you're coxswain for this evolution." Washington nodded once, taking position at the rear of the boat. "Launch on my mark," he ordered. 3, 2, 1, mark." They pushed the IBS through the breaking waves, timing their effort to avoid being swamped by the incoming surf. Once beyond the breakers, they began rowing with as much coordination as their exhausted state allowed. "Stroke, stroke, stroke," Washington called, setting a rhythm that was sustainable even for their depleted condition. His voice carried a natural authority that made following his commands seem like the only logical option. As they approached the dummy, Washington shifted gears smoothly. "Foster, Chen, prepare for recovery. Johnson, compensate portside. Mitchell, maintain heading." The practiced precision of his instructions stood in stark contrast to the chaotic shouting that usually characterized recruit-led evolutions. Under Washington's guidance, they executed the recovery with a minimum of wasted motion, securing the casualty in their boat. But as they turned back toward shore, a genuine emergency unfolded. Mitchell, whose exhaustion had progressed beyond any reasonable safety margin, suddenly slumped forward. His eyes rolled back and he collapsed face first into the boat. "Man down!" Chen called out. Washington moved immediately, rolling Mitchell onto his side while checking his airway. "He's breathing, but unresponsive," he reported with clinical detachment. "Heat exhaustion progressing to heat stroke. We need to cool his core temperature immediately." Without waiting for instructions from shore, Washington began directing emergency procedures. "Foster, pour seawater over his head and neck. Chen, elevate his feet. Johnson, row for shore. Maximum effort." The team responded instantly to the command voice that brooked no argument. As they struggled toward the beach, Washington removed Mitchell's helmet and loosened his uniform collar, continuing to pour water over his head and armpits. From shore, the instructors had spotted the emergency and were launching a motorized rescue boat. But Washington didn't wait for their arrival. He continued treating Mitchell with the focused efficiency of someone who had handled far worse situations under far more dangerous conditions. By the time they reached the shallows, Mitchell had regained partial consciousness, though he remained disoriented and confused. Medical personnel waded out to meet them, taking over care of the stricken recruit. As they carried Mitchell to the medical tent, Washington watched with an expression that revealed nothing of his thoughts. Reeves approached, clipboard tucked under his arm. "Good call out there, Master Chief." Washington nodded once, the only acknowledgement he seemed to require. "Mitchell's done," Reeves continued. "That leaves your boat crew short 2 men." "We'll adjust," Washington replied simply. Reeves studied him for a moment. "You saw the symptoms before he collapsed, didn't you? That's why you were already moving him into recovery position as he went down." It wasn't really a question, and Washington didn't treat it as one. Instead, he asked, "Will he recover fully?" "Corman says yes. You got to him quickly enough." Reeves hesitated, then added, "Just like Quang Tri Province, from what I hear." Washington's expression changed for just a moment, a flicker of surprise that someone knew that particular detail. "That was a long time ago, Chief. Not so long that people forget. The instructors have been talking. Word gets around when someone like you shows up in the program." Washington's response was careful, measured. "My old operations aren't relevant to these men's training, aren't they?" Reeves gestured toward the remaining recruits, now seated on the beach awaiting further instructions. "They're looking to you more than the cadre at this point. Like it or not, you're setting the example." Washington absorbed this without visible reaction. "They need to find their own way through this. I'm just another candidate." Reeves actually laughed at that. "No, Master Chief, you never were." After Reeves walked away, Foster approached cautiously. "Is Mitchell going to be okay?" Washington nodded. "He'll recover, but his hell week is over." "How did you know what was happening to him?" "1 second he seemed fine, then you were already moving before he even collapsed." "His pupils were different sizes," Washington explained. "Classic sign of neurological effects from overheating. Saw it in Vietnam more times than I can count." Chen joined them, his normally disciplined posture now a survival-focused slouch. "The way you handled that situation, it wasn't just from training. You've done mass casualty care in real conditions, haven't you?" Washington's eyes took on that distant quality again, looking at something far away in both space and time. "Laos, 1969, he said quietly. "We were extracting from a reconnaissance mission when our transport was hit by ground fire. Pilot managed a crash landing, but we had 3 critically wounded and enemy forces closing in. Had to stabilize the wounded while setting up a perimeter defense and calling for emergency extraction." It was more detail than he had previously shared about any single operation. Chen and Foster exchanged glances, recognizing the significance. "What happened?" Foster asked. Washington's expression remained neutral, but his voice carried the weight of memory. "We were 8 hours from nearest friendly forces, mediocre landing zone surrounded by heavy jungle. 2 of us uninjured, 3 walking wounded, 3 critical." He paused, looking out at the ocean. "We dug in, established security, stabilized who we could. I performed an emergency cricothyroidotomy on our door gunner with a pocket knife and a ballpoint pen." Both young men stared at him, trying to imagine the scene, the chaos, the pressure, the knowledge that failure meant death for everyone. "Did he make it?" Chen asked. "He did. Others didn't." Washington's tone made it clear that subject was closed. The brief glimpse into Washington's past hung in the air between them. Before either recruit could respond, Ramirez's whistle cut through their moment of connection. "Boat crews reorganize," she shouted. "Washington, Foster, Chen, you're combining with Thomas's crew for the next evolution." The merged boat crew now consisted of Washington, Foster, Chen, and 3 recruits they hadn't worked closely with before. The new dynamics would test their adaptability, a core quality of Special Operations Forces who often had to integrate with unfamiliar units in the field. As they took position around their IBS, Thomas, a former college football player with shoulders like boulders, immediately tried to assert dominance. "We run this boat my way," he announced. "My crew, My commands. Washington said nothing, simply taking position at a corner of the boat. Foster and Chen followed his lead, falling in without argument. The wisdom of this approach became apparent within the first half-mile of the next beach run. Thomas's leadership style, aggressive, loud, focused on maximum effort rather than sustainability, quickly began wearing down his original crew members. One of them, a recruit named Peterson, stumbled and nearly dropped his corner of the boat. "Need a break," he gasped. "Can't feel my arms." "No brakes," Thomas barked. "Push through it." Washington caught Chen's eye and gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head, a warning not to intervene. This was a lesson that needed to play out naturally. Peterson managed another quarter-mile before his strength gave out completely. His corner of the boat dipped dangerously, threatening to crash onto the sand. Washington reacted instantly, shifting position to compensate while Foster moved to support Peterson's section. Thomas exploded. "What the hell, Peterson? Get back on your corner." "He's done," Washington said quietly but firmly. "We need to redistribute the weight or lose the boat." "I give the orders here," Thomas snapped, his face flushed with exhaustion and anger. Washington's response was calm but carried an authority that silenced even Thomas. "You can give all the orders you want, but physics doesn't care. His muscles have failed. That's not a motivation problem. It's a physiological reality." The rest of the crew had stopped now, the boat balanced precariously among them. Thomas glared at Washington, pride warring with practicality. "What do you suggest?" he finally asked, his tone still defiant but with the first hint of uncertainty. "Rotate positions every quarter-mile," Washington replied. "Front positions to the back, back to the front. Distribute fatigue evenly across muscle groups and team members. That's not how we've been doing it." "And how's that working for your crew?" The simple question landed like a physical blow. Thomas looked at his exhausted teammates, then at Peterson, who could barely stand, and something in his expression shifted. "We'll try it your way," he conceded. The difference became apparent within minutes. The rotation system allowed partial recovery between maximum effort positions. Their pace actually increased despite their fatigue, and more importantly, became sustainable. By the time they returned to the main training area, Thomas was implementing Washington's suggestions without prompting, his earlier hostility replaced by a begrudging respect. It was a microcosm of the transformation happening across the entire class, the gradual recognition that Washington's methods weren't just different, but demonstrably superior for the environment they were operating in. As darkness fell on the third day, the remaining candidates gathered for a rare hot meal, a calculated move by the instructors to trigger a post-food energy crash that would make the night evolutions even more challenging. Washington ate methodically, consuming calories with the same practical efficiency he brought to every task. Chen, barely able to keep his eyes open, slumped on the bench beside him. "Master Chief," he mumbled through a mouthful of food, "are we going to make it?" The question held layers of meaning beyond the immediate challenge of Hell Week. Washington seemed to consider all of them before answering. "Some will, some won't," he said finally. "The difference isn't what you might think." "What is it then?" Washington set down his fork, giving Chen his full attention. "It's not about who's strongest or who wants it most. It's about who can embrace the fact that suffering has purpose beyond the moment." It was the kind of statement that would have sounded like meaningless philosophy before Hell Week began. Now, 72 hours into sustained torment, it resonated with a truth that Chen could feel in his bones. "Is that why you came back?" he asked. "To find purpose in suffering again?" Washington's eyes met his directly. "No, son. I came back to make sure the suffering I endured 50 years ago still has purpose today." The fourth day of Hell Week arrived without fanfare. No distinct separation from the endless night that preceded it. just a gradual lightening of the sky as tortured bodies continued moving through evolutions that had lost all meaning beyond the simple act of endurance. 12 candidates remained, their eyes sunken into dark hollows, movements reduced to the mechanical minimum required to avoid failure. Time itself had become elastic, stretching, contracting, folding back on itself. Some recruits reported experiencing the same evolution multiple times, unable to distinguish between reality and déjà vu. Others found themselves having conversations with people who weren't there, their exhausted minds manufacturing companions from memory. Washington showed signs of fatigue, too. It would have been inhuman not to, but they manifested differently. While younger men's deterioration expressed itself in stumbling movements and slurred speech, his manifested as a narrowing of focus, a retreat into an almost meditative state of conservation. Every action became even more precise, every word more carefully chosen. It was as if he were becoming more concentrated rather than depleted. The instructors had planned a special evolution for the 4th day, one designed to separate those who would ultimately succeed from those still destined to ring the bell. After a grueling 5-mile run, the class was marched to an inland training area they hadn't yet visited, the infamous Monster Mash. Before them sprawled what looked like a medieval torture chamber designed by sadists with engineering degrees, obstacle walls standing 3 times human height, muddy pits crossed by narrow logs, cargo nets stretched over pools of filthy water, tunnels barely wide enough for a man to crawl through, and climbing ropes hanging over concrete hard enough to shatter bones. "Welcome to the monster," Reeves announced with grim satisfaction. "You'll complete this course 10 times before sundown. Fail to complete all 10 and your entire remaining class rings the bell together." A ripple of despair passed through the exhausted recruits. Even at full strength, 10 runs through this nightmare would be challenging. In their current condition, it seemed impossible. "One more detail," Reeves continued. "You'll complete this evolution wearing these." He held up what appeared to be weighted vests, but when he tossed them to the ground, they landed with the unmistakable clank of real body armor, tactical plate carriers loaded with ceramic ballistic plates. 40 pounds of additional weight, Ramirez explained cheerfully. "Just like you'd wear in actual operations. Consider it a taste of reality, gentlemen." Foster stared at the equipment with undisguised horror. "We can barely stand as it is," he whispered to Chen. "How are we supposed to climb ropes wearing that?" Washington moved forward before Chen could respond, picking up one of the plate carriers and examining it with professional interest. He checked the plates, adjusted the straps, then slipped it over his head and secured it with practiced movements that spoke of years wearing such equipment in actual combat zones. "Distribute the weight across your shoulders and hips," he demonstrated, tightening various straps. "Keep it high and tight against your torso. If it shifts during movement, you'll waste energy constantly readjusting." The remaining recruits watched closely, following his example. Even Thomas, who had maintained a certain distance despite his growing respect, moved closer to observe Washington's technique. "First run is exploratory," Washington continued, his voice carrying the natural authority that had become their center of gravity. "Conserve energy, learn the obstacles, will increase efficiency with each iteration." It wasn't an official briefing. Washington held no formal leadership position, but no instructor interrupted. In fact, Reeves and Ramirez exchanged glances that seemed to contain a mutual acknowledgement. This was precisely why Washington was here. The first run through the monster was brutal. Even with Washington's advice on how to wear the armor effectively, several recruits barely completed the course. Foster actually vomited after the rope climb, his depleted body revolting against the impossible demands being placed upon it. Thomas twisted his ankle on a mud pit crossing but refused to acknowledge the injury, limping through the remaining obstacles through sheer willpower. As they staggered across the finish line of the first iteration, Washington gathered them in a tight circle, speaking quietly but intensely. "Second run, we work as a team," he instructed. "Strongest at each obstacle helps others through. No hero performances, no individual glory. The only metric that matters is getting every man across the finish line 10 times. Chen nodded wearily. "How do we distribute strengths?" "Foster and Richards on the rope climbs. They have the best technique despite fatigue. Chen and I take point on wall obstacles. We'll help pull others over. Thomas and Wilson handle the mud pit log crossings, best balance. Everyone supports tunnel crawls as needed." The clarity of his assessment, recognizing exactly who excelled at what despite their deteriorated condition, cut through the fog of their exhaustion. For the first time that day, they had something resembling a plan rather than just blind endurance. The second run went marginally better than the first. By the third, they had established a rhythm, calling out obstacles ahead, positioning team members to assist each other, distributing effort according to individual strengths. It wasn't pretty, but it was effective. During the fifth iteration, Thomas's ankle finally gave out completely as he attempted to cross the log over the mud pit. He crashed into the filthy water below, cursing in pain and frustration. Before the instructors could react, Washington was already moving through the pit toward him. "Can you put weight on it?" he asked, helping Thomas to the edge. Thomas tried and immediately winced. "No, it's done." Washington's expression didn't change. "Then we carry you." "That's insane," Thomas protested. "You can't complete this course carrying a man." "We're not leaving you behind," Washington stated with such finality that no one, not even the instructors, considered arguing. What followed was a masterclass in team adaptation. For the remaining 5 runs, the 11 other recruits rotated, carrying Thomas through the obstacles, sometimes piggyback, sometimes in a modified fireman's carry, sometimes with multiple men supporting different limbs depending on the challenge. Washington orchestrated it all, calling positions, directing movements, identifying the most efficient method for each section. Their pace slowed dramatically, but they maintained forward progress. The sun arced across the sky, beginning its descent toward the horizon as they struggled through the 8th iteration, then the 9th. With the final run looming and daylight fading, Foster reached his limit. "I can't," he gasped, collapsing at the base of the rope climb. Nothing left. Washington knelt beside him, the weight of the plate carrier making even this simple movement a challenge after hours of continuous exertion. "Look at me, son." Foster raised his head with visible effort, his eyes unfocused. "You're not climbing this rope for yourself anymore," Washington said, his voice low and intense. "You're climbing it for Thomas, who can't, for Rodriguez in the medical tent, for Mitchell, who went down in the boat, for everyone who isn't here to finish." Foster blinked, some clarity returning to his gaze. "And you're climbing it for Morris, Reynolds, Baker, Nichols, and Taylor," Washington continued. Chen, kneeling nearby, caught the significance immediately. Those weren't names from their class. Washington was naming his lost teammates from Vietnam. "I couldn't carry them all out," Washington said, a tremor in his voice nearly imperceptible beneath his controlled exterior. "Some debts can never be repaid, but we honor them by refusing to break when that would be the easier path." Something shifted in Foster's expression, a recognition of something larger than his own suffering. With trembling muscles, he pushed himself upright. "Help me to the rope," he whispered. Washington and Chen supported him to the base of the climb. Foster stared up at the seemingly impossible height, then looked back at Washington. "For your team," he said simply, then began to climb. As darkness fell completely, the last recruit crossed the finish line of the 10th iteration. They had done what everyone, perhaps even the instructors, had considered impossible, 12 broken men, one unable to walk under his own power, had conquered the monster mash wearing full combat loads despite days of sleepless torment. Reeves approached as they collapsed in exhaustion, his clipboard forgotten at his side. For once, his perpetual scowl had been replaced by something resembling respect. "That's one for the record books," he admitted. "I've never seen a class complete the monster carrying an injured man." Washington, still helping support Thomas, merely nodded in acknowledgement. "Get back to the compound," Reeves continued. "Medical will evaluate Thomas's ankle. The rest of you have boat evolution in 30 minutes. As the battered recruits helped each other toward the transport vehicles, Ramirez fell in beside Washington. "That speech you gave Foster," she said quietly. "Those were your men? From Laos?" Washington's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Yes." "I've read the redacted reports," she continued, "but they don't tell the whole story, do they?" "No report ever does." Ramirez hesitated, then asked what had clearly been on her mind for some time, "Why now, Master Chief, after all these years, why put yourself through this again?" Washington was silent for several steps, and Ramirez had begun to think he wouldn't answer. Then, so quietly she had to strain to hear, "Because the last surviving member of my original team is dying. Pancreatic cancer. He asked to see me one last time." The admission hung between them as they continued walking, Ramirez processing its implications. And this, Hell Week, was a prerequisite? "No," Washington replied. "This was my choice. I needed to know if I still had what it took to earn the right to see him again." Later, as the remains of the class prepared for their next evolution, a night landing exercise that would push their boat handling skills to the limit, Chen approached Washington, who was adjusting his helmet strap with the same methodical precision he brought to every task. "Master Chief," Chen said hesitantly, "I overheard what you told Instructor Ramirez about your teammate." Washington's hands paused briefly, then continued their work. He didn't respond, but neither did he shut down the conversation. "The names you listed for Foster," Chen continued, "you said you couldn't carry them all out. Is that what's been driving you all these years? The ones you couldn't save?" Washington finally looked up, his eyes reflecting the harsh floodlights illuminating the beach staging area. For a moment, the carefully maintained composure cracked, revealing something raw and wounded beneath. "We were trapped 3 clicks from the LZ," he said, his voice distant. "Morris was already gone. Taylor took her round to the femoral artery, bled out in minutes. I had Reynolds and Baker on my shoulders, alternating when one got too heavy. Nichols was still walking, though his arm was nearly severed at the shoulder." He paused, the memory so vivid it seemed to physically transport him. "NVA patrol cut us off, had to hide in a bomb crater. Nichols passed out from blood loss. Baker started showing signs of shock. I couldn't move them all at once, and leaving someone meant certain death if they were found." Chen waited, hardly breathing, knowing he was hearing something Washington had perhaps never fully voiced. "Made the call to move them one by one. Took Reynolds first. He had the best chance of survival. Made it to the LZ, signaled for extraction, headed back for the others." Washington's voice was mechanical now, as if reading from a report. "By the time I returned, the NVA had found the crater. Baker was already dead, Nichols too. They were..." He stopped, unable or unwilling to describe what he had found. "You made the only choice you could," Chen said softly. Washington's eyes refocused on the present, some of the professional mask sliding back into place. "Knowing that intellectually doesn't change how it feels, son. Some burdens don't get lighter with time. You just get stronger at carrying them." Before Chen could respond, Reeves's whistle cut through the night air, signaling the beginning of the next evolution. Washington rose in a single fluid motion that belied his age and exhaustion. "Remember what you're feeling right now," he said to Chen. "Someday you might have to make a similar choice. And when that day comes, I hope someone has prepared you for the weight of it." Dawn of the fifth day didn't so much arrive as seep into consciousness, a gradual realization that darkness had given way to gray light, though for many recruits, the distinction hardly mattered anymore. They existed in a liminal space between waking and sleeping, their bodies moving through required motions while their minds floated somewhere distant, untethered from normal reality. Only 10 remained now. Thomas had been medically rolled after an X-ray confirmed a hairline fracture in his ankle. Another recruit, Wilson, had suffered a seizure during the night evolution, his electrolyte balance disrupted beyond safe parameters by days of sweating without adequate replacement. The remainder of the class sat on the beach in a loose semicircle, their eyes vacant as Instructor Reeves outlined the day's first evolution. Most couldn't process his words as language anymore. They merely responded to tones and gestures following the examples of those around them. 4-mile beach run with full gear, Reeves concluded, and because I'm feeling generous, you'll get to carry these as well. He gestured to a row of telephone poles, smaller than the logs they had been carrying all week, but still formidable burdens for men in their condition. "1 log, 2 men," Reeves explained. "Partner up." The recruits moved with zombie-like slowness to comply. Chen automatically gravitated toward Washington, who stood with the same perfect posture he'd maintained since day 1, though his eyes now held the same distance that had overtaken the others. Foster, lacking a partner with Wilson's departure, approached them hesitantly. "Mind if I join you too?" Chen looked at Washington, who considered for a moment, then nodded. "We'll rotate. 2 carry, 1 recovers. Switch every quarter mile." It was a violation of Reeves's instructions, but the instructor either didn't notice or chose not to correct them. The lines between rule following and practical adaptation had blurred as Hell Week progressed, with survival and completion taking precedence over strict adherence to initial commands. As they hoisted their log and began the run, Washington moving with the same measured efficiency that had become their lifeline, Chen found himself wondering aloud, "How many more evolutions? When does this end?" "They don't tell you," Foster replied, his voice a rasp from days of exposure to salt water and shouting. "That's part of the test, not knowing." Washington, balancing his end of the log with mechanical precision, spoke without turning his head. 6 more hours. Both younger men stared at him. "How do you know?" Foster asked. "Administrative patterns, instructor rotation schedules, medical team shift changes." Washington adjusted his grip slightly. "They're preparing for the final evolution and reset." Chen realized Washington had been tracking these details the entire time, observing, analyzing, building a mental model of the training structure even while enduring its punishments. It was yet another reminder of the difference between surviving Hell Week and understanding it. The beach run stretched endlessly, their world narrowing to the weight of the log and the burn in their muscles. But unlike previous evolutions where each man suffered in isolation, they had developed a rhythm together, a wordless coordination that distributed the burden across their team. When Foster began to falter during his carrying rotation, Chen moved closer, subtly taking more weight without making it obvious to the instructors. When Chen's back spasmed near the 3rd mile, Washington shifted the log's position to change the angle of stress. They had become a single organism with 3 bodies, adapting continuously to protect its weakest points. As they approached the final stretch of beach, Washington suddenly broke the silence. "Your grandfather," he said to Chen, his voice steady despite the exertion. "The Flying Tiger." "What was his name?" Chen blinked in surprise at the unexpected question. "Li Chen. Everyone called him Li." Washington's pace faltered for just a moment. the first break in his metronomic precision that Chen had witnessed. "Lieutenant Li Chen, 3rd Squadron?" Chen nearly stumbled. "Yes. How did you—" "I met him," Washington said. "Bangkok, 1967, CIA safe house. He was advising on a cross-border operation." The revelation hit Chen like a physical blow. "That's impossible. My grandfather never mentioned working with CIA after the war." Washington finished for him. "Most didn't. Operations in Thailand, Laos, parts of Vietnam, all highly compartmentalized. He would have been bound by the same secrecy we were." Chen struggled to process this connection across decades and continents. He told stories about the Flying Tigers, but nothing about after. "There was a reason for that," Washington replied. His voice remained even, but something in his tone suggested deeper waters. "Some missions don't make for good stories." Foster, listening to this exchange with exhausted curiosity, asked, "Was Chen's grandfather on one of your operations?" Washington was silent for several steps. "Not directly. He provided intelligence that made one possible, critical intelligence." "Which operation?" Chen asked, suddenly desperate to connect these fragments of a history he'd never known existed. Washington's response was barely audible above the sound of their boots on sand. "The one that earned me this." His hand moved briefly to his chest, where they knew the Navy Cross would be pinned on his dress uniform, the decoration Thomas had mentioned during the briefing, awarded for valor above and beyond the call of duty, second only to the Medal of Honor. Before Chen could press for details, they reached the end of the beach run. Reeves was waiting, stopwatch in hand, his face betraying nothing as he recorded their time. "Place your logs in the rack and hydrate," he ordered. "Next evolution in 10 minutes. As they carefully set down their burden, Chen turned to Washington, questions burning through his exhaustion. But Washington shook his head slightly. "Not here, not now." The day continued its brutal progression. Each evolution blended into the next. More boat drills, more ocean swims, more log PT, more running. The instructors maintained the pressure, but something had changed in how they interacted with the remaining candidates. The mockery had evaporated completely, replaced by a grim respect. These 10 had survived when 20 others had not. They had proven something essential about themselves, regardless of whether they ultimately completed the full training pipeline. During a rare lull between evolutions, as they huddled under a tent performing weapons maintenance on salt-encrusted training rifles, Chen finally found an opportunity to continue their conversation. "Master Chief," he said quietly, hands automatically breaking down his rifle, "what did my grandfather's intelligence help you do?" Washington's hands never stopped their precise movements on his own weapon, but his voice dropped to ensure only Chen and Foster could hear. "POW camp on the Laotian border," he replied. "Chinese advisors running it with North Vietnamese guards. Your grandfather identified the location and provided details on rotation schedules, fortifications, approximate prisoner count." "The mission where your team was lost," Foster murmured, putting the pieces together. Washington nodded once, a minute gesture. "We inserted 6 men. Primary objective was intelligence gathering, confirmation of camps and conditions for potential larger rescue operation. But conditions on the ground changed." "What happened?" Chen asked, his voice barely a whisper. "We observed 3 prisoners being removed for transport, loaded into trucks. Based on physical descriptions, we believed one might be an Air Force pilot who'd been shot down 3 months prior. Command gave us discretion to attempt immediate extraction if opportunity presented." Washington field stripped his rifle with mechanical perfection, the routine so deeply ingrained that it required no conscious thought, allowing his mind to travel back across decades to that jungle. "We set up an ambush on the road, 2 clicks from the camp. Things went wrong immediately. More guards than intelligence indicated. Reinforced transport we weren't equipped to deal with. But we were committed. Chen and Foster had stopped pretending to clean their weapons, transfixed by Washington's account. Firefight lasted 12 minutes. We neutralized the enemy force but lost Morris in the initial exchange. The prisoner was indeed the Air Force pilot, Lieutenant Colonel James Harwick, along with 2 South Vietnamese ARVN officers. Washington reassembled his rifle with practiced movements. Extraction plan was compromised. Had to move overland to secondary LZ, 26 kilometers through jungle with wounded men and 3 malnourished prisoners. NVA response was massive. They knew exactly who Harwick was and what he knew. And that's when everything went to hell, Washington confirmed. 4 days of running, hiding, carrying wounded through triple canopy jungle, radio damaged in the ambush, limited ammunition, no support. The tent around them seemed to fade away as Washington continued, his voice detached as if reading from a report, though his eyes held the living memory. By the 4th day, it was down to me, Reynolds with a bullet in his chest, and Harwick, who could barely walk from malnutrition, made it to the extraction point only to find NVA waiting, had to create a diversion. Washington fell silent, his rifle now completely reassembled, his hands perfectly still for the first time. "You went in alone," Foster stated, not asking. "Had no choice. Left Reynolds with morphine and the last magazine. Took Harwick through a ravine bypass, then circled back to draw fire away from the LZ. Called it an envelopment maneuver in the report. Really, it was a suicide play that didn't go as expected." "But you survived," Chen said. Washington's eyes finally met his directly. "Your grandfather's intelligence included details not in the official brief. Drainage tunnel under the eastern perimeter, collapsed sections of the camp that created blind spots in their security. Without that knowledge, there would have been no survivors." Chen felt the weight of this connection across generations. His grandfather's hidden role in this classified chapter of military history, and the life debt that connected him to Washington. "Lieutenant Colonel Harwick made it out," Washington continued. "Reynolds, too, though he died of his wounds 3 days later. And the intelligence Harwick carried, details of the North Vietnamese supply routes, Chinese advisory operations, Russian equipment shipments, changed the course of multiple operations. That's why you received the Navy Cross," Foster said. "That's the official reason," Washington corrected him. "The actual mission remains classified. The citation mentions extraordinary heroism and grave danger, but none of the specifics. And my grandfather's role was never acknowledged," Chen added, understanding dawning. "Your grandfather saved my life without ever knowing it," Washington confirmed. "His intelligence gave me the tools to survive when survival should have been impossible." Before Chen could respond, Ramirez appeared at the entrance to the tent, her presence immediately snapping them back to the present reality of Hell Week. 2-minute warning, she announced. "Wrap it up." As they prepared to return to the beach for the next evolution, Washington placed a hand briefly on Chen's shoulder, a gesture so unexpected from the usually reserved man that Chen froze. "When this is over," Washington said quietly, "I have something for you. Something your grandfather would want you to have." The moment passed quickly as they rejoined the rest of the class, but its significance lingered like a physical weight. Chen found himself moving through the next evolution with renewed purpose despite his broken body and exhausted mind. The connection to his grandfather's hidden past had provided something Hell Week deliberately stripped away, meaning beyond mere endurance. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, marking the approach of the 5th night, the remaining recruits sensed a shift in the instructor's demeanor. There was a subtle anticipation in the air, a sense that they were approaching some significant threshold. Reeves gathered them on the beach as darkness fell, his clipboard absent for the first time all week. When he spoke, his voice carried an unusual note of sincerity. "You've reached the final evolution of Hell Week," he announced. One last test before you earn the right to rest." The recruits exchanged wary glances, too experienced in the instructor's mind games to fully trust this pronouncement. Washington's expression remained neutral, but his posture shifted subtly, a minute tension that only those who had studied him closely might notice. "Boat crews to the water's edge," Reeves ordered. "Paddles ready." As they took position beside their IBS, Washington caught Foster's eye. "Whatever comes next," he said quietly, "remember why you're here, not just for yourself." Foster nodded, too exhausted for words but understanding the message. As they pushed their boat into the surf one final time, the weight of all they had endured and all that Washington had shared traveled with them like invisible passengers. The true test still awaited, but something fundamental had already been transformed. They were no longer the same men who had mocked an elderly interloper at the beginning of the week. And Washington was no longer carrying his burden alone. Night had fully claimed the ocean by the time the boat crews pushed into the surf, paddling through breaking waves into the inky darkness beyond. With no moon and heavy cloud cover, the horizon disappeared entirely, water and sky merging into a single void that swallowed light, sound, and hope with equal indifference. "Head for the marker buoy," Reeves called from the instructor boat that shadowed them. 2 miles offshore. When you reach it, you'll receive further instructions." The remaining recruits dug their paddles into the water, bodies functioning purely on instinct and muscle memory. Foster had reached a state beyond exhaustion where his limbs seemed disconnected from his consciousness, as if they belonged to someone else and he was merely observing their movement. Chen's world had narrowed to the rhythmic splash of his paddle and the burning protest of his shoulders. Only Washington maintained the same methodical cadence he'd established days earlier, though even his movements had acquired a mechanical quality that spoke of reserves approaching depletion. "Something's wrong," Foster whispered as they passed beyond the breakers into open ocean. "This isn't a standard evolution." Chen nodded weakly. "Too far offshore for night training. We don't even have safety boats positioned." Washington said nothing, but his eyes constantly scanned the darkness around them, assessing, calculating. His experience recognized what the others sensed. The pattern had changed, the rules shifted. 20 minutes into their paddle, the instructor boat's spotlight suddenly blazed to life, illuminating their position. Reeves's voice carried across the water. "This is the final test, gentlemen. You've reached the absolute limit of physical endurance. Now we find out what you're really made of." The spotlight shifted, revealing something floating in the water ahead, a cylindrical object about 4 feet long. "Recover that training dummy and return to shore. First boat to complete the evolution ends Hell Week for the entire class." A murmur passed through the exhausted recruits. This wasn't the usual protocol for finishing Hell Week. Typically, the instructors simply announced the end after a final evolution, not this competitive scenario. "It's a trick," one recruit hissed from another boat. "Has to be." "Focus," Washington said, his voice cutting through the confusion. "Priority is recovery first, questions later." Their boat surged forward, 3 sets of paddles digging into the black water with renewed purpose. The other boat crews followed, a race developing despite their depleted condition. Adrenaline, the last chemical resource their bodies could muster, temporarily masked the pain of abused muscles and sleep-deprived minds. As they approached the floating object, Washington suddenly stiffened. "Hold position," he ordered, his tone brooking no argument. Chen and Foster complied instantly, paddles raised, dripping above the water. "What's wrong?" Chen asked. Washington's eyes hadn't left the object. "That's not a training dummy." Before either could respond, Washington removed his helmet and boots with quick, efficient movements. "Maintain boat stability," he instructed, then slipped over the side into the ocean without another word. Chen and Foster exchanged alarmed glances, then quickly redistributed their weight to prevent the boat from capsizing. They watched as Washington's dark form cut through the water with powerful strokes toward the floating object. The other boat crews had noticed something amiss and slowed their approach, watching with confusion. When Washington reached the cylinder, his behavior confirmed their suspicions. Instead of simply grabbing it, he circled cautiously, examining it from all angles before carefully approaching. Even from a distance, they could see the unnatural precision in his movements. Not the actions of an exhausted Hell Week candidate, but of a trained operator assessing a potentially dangerous situation. After what seemed an eternity, Washington secured the object and began swimming back toward their boat, towing it beside him. As he approached, Foster extended his paddle to help. "Careful," Washington warned, his voice tight with controlled urgency. "It's a live CSR dummy." Chen sucked in a breath. Combat search and rescue dummies were sophisticated training devices used to simulate wounded personnel recovery, complete with realistic medical features for trauma assessment and treatment. This was far beyond the scope of normal Bud-S training. With careful coordination, they brought both Washington and the dummy aboard, stabilizing the boat against the additional weight. Now in the relative safety of their craft, Washington immediately began examining the dummy with practiced hands, checking airways, pulse points, and simulated wounds. "Multiple trauma indicators," he reported clinically. "Tension pneumothorax simulation active. Arterial bleeding simulation in left femoral region. Signs of hypothermia." Chen stared at Washington's hands, moving with practiced efficiency. Not the fumbling attempts of a trainee, but the confident assessment of someone who had performed these procedures countless times under far worse conditions. "This isn't part of Hell Week," Foster whispered. "This is something else." Washington met his eyes briefly. "Paddle for shore. Maximum effort. This isn't a race anymore, it's a rescue scenario." As they drove their boat toward the distant beach, the instructor craft approached. Reeves's voice carried over the water. "Time critical, gentlemen. Your casualty has approximately 20 minutes before systems failure." The other boat crews, now understanding the nature of the evolution, had turned toward shore as well. This wasn't competition. It was a test of their ability to prioritize mission over individual achievement. Washington continued treating the dummy, applying pressure to simulated wounds and positioning it to maintain proper airway function. His movements were so automatic they seemed almost unconscious, muscle memory developed through experiences none of the young recruits could fully comprehend. "Master Chief," Chen gasped between paddle strokes, "you've done this before, for real." Washington didn't look up from his work. "Many times. Vietnam, and after." His hands never stopped moving. "Beirut, Panama, places without names." Foster, straining with the effort of paddling, asked, "Is this why you came back? To teach this?" Washington was silent for several strokes before answering. "Some lessons can only be taught through experience. Some experiences can only be conveyed by those who've lived them." As they approached the shore, they could see a medical team waiting with stretchers and equipment, a far more sophisticated setup than the routine medical presence during training. This evolution had been carefully planned, designed to test their ability to function under maximum stress while performing a critical mission. The moment their boat hit the sand, Washington took charge with a natural authority no one thought to question. "Foster, secure the boat. Chen, help me with casualty transfer, careful of the neck and spine." They executed his commands without hesitation, transferring the dummy to the waiting medical team, who immediately began their own assessment procedures. Only then did the recruits notice Commander Thomas standing nearby, observing the entire operation with intense focus. "Time?" he asked as the medical team continued working. 17 minutes from recovery to shore delivery," Reeves reported, checking his stopwatch. "Within operational parameters." Thomas nodded once, then turned to address the exhausted candidates who had collapsed on the beach after securing their boats. "Hell Week is officially complete," he announced, his voice carrying more genuine respect than they had heard all week. But this final evolution wasn't just about testing your endurance. It was about seeing if you could still execute a mission when your bodies and minds were at their absolute limit. The recruits stared at him through eyes sunken with fatigue, barely processing his words. "Real operations don't care if you're tired, cold, or haven't slept in days," Thomas continued. "Sometimes the most critical missions come when you're at your weakest point. That's why we push you beyond normal human limits, because the battlefield will demand exactly that." He gestured toward Washington, who stood slightly apart, his posture still professional despite 5 days of continuous physical punishment. Master Chief Washington has lived this reality. On his final operation in Laos, he executed a combat search and rescue mission after 4 days of continuous evasion, wounded without food, suffering from malaria. The pilot he saved later provided intelligence that saved hundreds of American lives. The magnitude of this information settled over the beach like a physical weight. The younger recruits looked at Washington with new understanding, not just of what he had done, but of why this training mattered beyond mere selection. "You've earned the right to rest," Thomas concluded. "Medical will evaluate everyone, then transport to the barracks. You'll have 36 hours of recovery before training resumes." As the recruits were helped toward the medical tents for evaluation, Washington remained behind, speaking quietly with Thomas. Foster and Chen, waiting their turn for medical checks, watched the interaction with interest. "Something's happening," Chen murmured. This wasn't just about finishing Hell Week for him. Foster nodded weakly. "Whatever he came back to do, I think it's about to happen." The next 12 hours passed in a blur of blessed unconsciousness as the survivors of Hell Week surrendered to the deepest sleep most had ever experienced. Medical staff monitored them continuously, administering fluids, nutrients, and in some cases medication to address the physical damage inflicted by their ordeal. Chen awoke to sunlight streaming through windows, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar sensation of comfort. He was in a recovery ward, not the barracks, a concession to the medical needs of the class. Around him, other recruits slept in various positions, some still hooked to IV drips, others snoring with the utter abandonment of the truly exhausted. He checked his watch, 1400 hours. He had slept for nearly 14 hours straight. His body felt simultaneously better and worse, the restorative power of sleep battling with the accumulated damage from 5 days of continuous activity. Every muscle protested as he carefully sat up, taking inventory of his condition. A movement caught his attention. Washington sat in a chair near the door, fully dressed in his uniform rather than medical garb, watching over the room with the vigilant calm that had become his signature. Their eyes met, and Washington nodded slightly in acknowledgement. Chen carefully extracted himself from his bed, mindful of stiff joints and aching muscles, and made his way across the room. Washington gestured to an empty chair beside him. "How are you feeling?" Washington asked, his voice lower than usual to avoid disturbing the others. "Like I've been hit by a truck," Chen admitted. "But alive." Washington nodded. "The second day of recovery is worse than the first. Your body starts cataloging all the damage once the immediate survival response fades." Chen studied Washington's face, noting that while fatigue still marked his features, his eyes held the same clear focus they always had, as if his mind operated independently from his body's condition. "You didn't sleep, did you?" Chen asked. "A few hours enough." Chen hesitated, then asked the question that had lingered since their conversation on the beach. "You mentioned having something for me, something of my grandfather's." Washington reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, wrapped in a faded handkerchief. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing what appeared to be a battered metal cigarette case. "This isn't actually from your grandfather," Washington clarified, "but it exists because of him." He handed the case to Chen, who took it with careful reverence. The metal was scratched and dented with what appeared to be a small bullet indentation on one side. Chen opened it to find not cigarettes but a folded piece of paper, yellow with age. "During the operation in Laos," Washington explained, "I carried that case in my breast pocket. When we were ambushed after extracting Harwick, a round struck me directly over the heart." Chen's eyes widened as he looked at the dent with new understanding. "The case deflected it enough to save my life," Washington continued. "Inside was the map your grandfather had helped create, the details of escape routes and hidden passages that ultimately allowed me to get Harwick out alive." Chen carefully unfolded the paper to reveal a hand-drawn map. The lines faded but still visible, with Chinese characters in the margins that he recognized as his grandfather's handwriting. "He never knew you personally?" Chen asked, trying to process this connection across decades. "No. He provided the intelligence to CIA handlers, who passed it to our operational command. Compartmentalization was standard procedure, but his work saved my life twice over, once from the bullet, once by showing me the way out when all conventional routes were compromised." Washington gestured to the case. "I've carried that with me on every operation since then. A reminder that sometimes survival depends on knowledge you don't know you need until the critical moment." Chen stared at the artifact in his hands, a physical link to both his grandfather's secret past and Washington's legendary one. "Why give this to me now?" Washington's expression softened slightly. "Because debts should be acknowledged while there's still time, and because some burdens are meant to be passed to those who can carry them forward." The weight of Washington's words settled between them, carrying implications Chen couldn't fully grasp in his still recovering state. But he understood enough. This wasn't just about honoring the past, it was about something still unfolding in the present. "Master Chief," he began carefully, "what happens after Hell Week for you?" Washington's eyes shifted toward the window, looking at something far beyond the naval base. "I have one final mission to complete." 3 days after the conclusion of Hell Week, the surviving candidates returned to regular training, bodies still recovering but minds transformed by an experience that had fundamentally altered their understanding of their own limits. Of the original 28 who began, only 10 remained, bonded now by something deeper than mere shared hardship. But one face was conspicuously absent. Master Chief Washington had not rejoined the class. "Temporary assignment," Instructor Reeves explained curtly when Chen inquired. "That's all you need to know." But Chen suspected there was more to the story, particularly after his final conversation with Washington about the one last mission he needed to complete. Foster shared his curiosity, though both kept their speculations private, respecting the confidential nature of whatever had called Washington away. 2 weeks passed. The class settled into the rhythm of second-phase training, focusing on combat diving and underwater operations. Their bodies healed, strength returned, and the acute memories of Hell Week gradually transformed into the dull ache of formative experience. Painful, but necessary, like the breaking and resetting of a bone. Then, on a Wednesday morning as they prepared for pool training, Commander Thomas entered their classroom, his expression solemn. "Gather round," he ordered. "There's something you need to know." The recruits exchanged glances, sensing the gravity in his tone. They assembled in a loose semicircle, still dripping from their pre-class shower, wondering what announcement warranted the program commander's personal delivery. "As you've noticed, Master Chief Washington has been absent these past weeks," Thomas began. "It's time you understood why." He produced a folder from under his arm, opening it to reveal what appeared to be newspaper clippings and official documents. James Washington was part of what military historians now call the precursor teams to modern Navy SEALs, special operations units that conducted missions considered too sensitive or politically complicated for conventional forces. Thomas's voice took on the measured cadence of a man explaining something of great importance. His specific unit, operating under Mac V SOG in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, was called Spectre Team, though official records acknowledge neither their existence nor their operations. Foster raised his hand tentatively. "Sir, we heard some of this during Hell Week. Is there something new?" Thomas nodded. Last month, the Department of Defense, in conjunction with the CIA, finally declassified portions of a particular operation conducted in 1970, the one that earned Washington his Navy Cross. This declassification was accelerated due to special circumstances involving the last surviving member of the original team, besides Washington himself. Chen felt a chill that had nothing to do with his damp uniform. He remembered Washington's words to Ramirez about a teammate dying of pancreatic cancer. Captain Raymond Harwick, the pilot rescued during that operation, has been advocating for decades to have the full story acknowledged and proper recognition given to the men who saved him. Thomas continued, "With his cancer now in terminal stages, the DoD made an unprecedented decision to expedite the process." He handed out copies of what appeared to be a news article from the Washington Post dated just 3 days earlier. The headline read, "Forgotten Heroes, Secret Vietnam-Era Unit Finally Receives Recognition." Below the headline was a photograph that caused several recruits to gasp audibly. It showed a formal military ceremony in what appeared to be a hospital room. A frail, elderly white man in a bed wearing a dress uniform jacket over hospital gown was pinning a medal on Washington, who stood at attention beside him in full dress blues, face solemn and dignified. Behind them stood several high-ranking military officers and what appeared to be family members. 2 days ago, Thomas explained, in a private ceremony at Walter Reed Medical Center, Master Chief Washington was awarded the Medal of Honor for actions during Operation White Star, the classified mission to rescue Captain Harwick and gather intelligence on POW camps in Laos. The room fell completely silent. The Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration, awarded for acts of valor above and beyond the call of duty, often posthumously because the actions it recognized were frequently fatal to those who performed them. The citation, now declassified, details how Washington, after his entire team was killed or critically wounded, single-handedly engaged an enemy force over 20 times his size to create a diversion, allowing the rescued pilot to reach extraction. He then evaded capture for 9 days while wounded, suffering from malaria, and carrying critical intelligence that ultimately saved hundreds of American lives. Thomas's voice had taken on a tone of undisguised admiration, rare from a man known for his professional detachment. Captain Harwick passed away yesterday morning, just hours after presenting the medal he had fought for decades to have properly awarded. Master Chief Washington was with him until the end. Chen felt his throat tighten as the full picture came into focus. Washington's return to Bud S hadn't just been about proving himself or passing on knowledge. It had been a pilgrimage of sorts, a journey to become worthy of facing the man he had saved, to honor their shared past with one final act of endurance. "Washington will be returning tomorrow," Thomas continued. "He has requested to complete the training cycle with your class, though obviously not as a student." Foster raised his hand again. "Sir, if I may ask, why did it take 50 years for this recognition? And why did Master Chief Washington never push for it himself?" Thomas considered the question carefully before answering. "2 reasons, recruit. First, the operation remained classified until now because it confirmed American military presence in countries where we officially had no combat troops. Second, He paused, choosing his words with care. The military of that era wasn't always eager to spotlight the heroism of certain service members, particularly when it might highlight questions about who was being sent into the most dangerous situations. The implication was clear but delicate. Washington's race had played a role in the delayed recognition, an uncomfortable truth that reflected the complicated history of a nation still struggling with its promises of equality. As for why Washington never pushed for recognition himself, Thomas continued, you'll have to ask him that directly. But based on my conversations with him, I believe he felt the medal belonged more to his fallen teammates than to himself. He was simply the one who survived to carry their story. The next morning, the class assembled on the beach for physical training, the pre-dawn darkness still heavy around them. As they began their warm-up exercises, a solitary figure approached from the direction of the administrative buildings. Washington, dressed in the standard Bud ES instructor uniform, moving with the same measured cadence they had come to know so well. He took position beside Reeves and Ramirez without fanfare or introduction. When Reeves nodded to him to take the lead, Washington stepped forward to address the class. "Recovery from Hell Week going well?" he asked, his voice carrying the same calm authority it always had. No reference to his absence, no acknowledgement of the momentous event they all now knew had occurred. The class responded with a unified, "Yes, Instructor Washington," the change in title a natural recognition of his new official role. Good, because second phase is where the real work begins. He surveyed them with the experienced eye of a man who had seen generations of warriors come and go. The medal you may have read about, that belongs to history. What matters is right here, right now, and the teammates standing beside you. It was vintage Washington, deflecting personal attention, refocusing on the mission and the team. But something had subtly changed in his demeanor, a weight lifted that even his extraordinary self-discipline hadn't been able to fully conceal before. During the morning evolution, as the class rotated through underwater knot-tying drills, Foster found himself partnered with Washington for a demonstration. "Congratulations, Master Chief," Foster said quietly as they prepared the training ropes. The medal was long overdue. Washington nodded once in acknowledgement. Captain Harwick was a good man, spent 50 years making sure the story wasn't forgotten, even when most wanted it buried. His persistence, not mine. "You could have pushed for recognition yourself," Foster observed. Washington's hands continued working the complex knot without hesitation. "That medal has 6 names on it, son. Mine's just the only one still walking around to wear it." Later, as the class prepared for afternoon classroom instruction, Chen approached Washington during a brief break. He carried with him the cigarette case he'd been given after Hell Week. "Master Chief," he said hesitantly, "after reading the full story, I think this belongs with you and your Medal of Honor. It was part of that mission." He held out the case, offering it back to the man who had carried it for 50 years. But Washington shook his head. "That case has served its purpose with me," he said. "Now it has a new mission, connecting past to future." He nodded toward the case. "Your grandfather's knowledge saved my life. Perhaps someday, that knowledge will save yours or someone else's." Chen nodded, understanding the responsibility being entrusted to him. "There's something I've been wanting to ask," he said after a moment. "Your tattoo, the one Foster noticed that first day, it's different from the modern trident." Washington's expression softened slightly. "Because it predates the official SEAL insignia. When our unit was formed, we didn't have a formal designation or insignia. After the operation where we lost Morris and Taylor, the 6 of us created our own, a promise to each other." He rolled up his sleeve slightly, revealing the lower edge of the tattoo, the part that had remained hidden until now. Below the trident-like insignia were 6 sets of initials, each accompanied by a date. 4 of the dates were identical. One was much more recent, yesterday's date. "The dates they died?" Chen asked quietly. Washington nodded. "And now all accounts are settled. All promises kept." Chen absorbed this. The tattoo wasn't just a military insignia. It was a memorial, a roster of the fallen, and a chronicle of Washington's half-century mission to honor his teammates' sacrifice. The last date represented Harwick, the pilot they had saved, whose death had closed the final chapter of their shared story. "Is that why you came back to Bud S? To prepare yourself to face him one last time?" "Partly," Washington acknowledged, "but also to make sure that what we learned, what we paid for in blood, doesn't die with us." He gestured toward the class, now assembling for the afternoon session. "You men will face different wars, different challenges than we did, but some truths remain constant across generations." "What truths, Master Chief?" Washington considered the question, his eyes taking in the young men who had journeyed from mocking an elderly interloper to respecting a living legend. "That our capacity for endurance is greater than we imagine. That true strength comes not from dominating others, but from refusing to abandon them. That the burdens we carry define us more than the accolades we receive." He paused, then added, "And that sometimes the most important victories are the ones no one ever sees or celebrates, the private battles won in jungles with no name, in hearts with no witness." As they walked together toward the classroom, Foster joined them, falling into step naturally. Around the base, other recruits and instructors stopped to render respectful nods or salutes to Washington, the Medal of Honor recipient now recognized not just for his historic achievements, but for his continued commitment to the future warriors he was helping forge. "I've been thinking, Master Chief," Foster said as they approached the building, "that first day when we were all laughing about the old man in our class, you could have shut us down immediately, revealed who you were, what you'd done, why didn't you?" Washington's answer came without hesitation, distilling 50 years of wisdom into a single perfect truth. "Because respect based on what's on your chest isn't respect at all. It's just fear or admiration. Real respect is earned through actions, not history. You men needed to see what I could do, not what I had done." As they entered the classroom, the entire class rose to attention, not because regulations required it, but because genuine respect demanded it. The elderly black man who had once been mocked now moved among them as both legend and mentor, his mysterious tattoo no longer a curiosity, but a sacred text written in sacrifice and honor. And on his chest, beside the Navy Cross that had acknowledged half the truth for half a century, now rested the Medal of Honor that completed the story, not just of one man's extraordinary courage, but of a team whose bond transcended death, race, time, and the convenient lies of official history. Their legacy now lived not just in Washington's memories or in newly declassified documents, but in the transformed hearts and minds of a new generation of warriors who had learned the most important lesson of all, that true greatness often walks among us unrecognized, until we have the wisdom to see beyond our own prejudices and the courage to endure alongside it.